Well, let's look more closely now at the humanitarian and diplomatic efforts, which the Prime Minister says are just as important as military action. In terms of diplomacy, that effectively revolves around talks in Vienna involving countries like Iran, Russia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the US, France, Britain, but not Syria. Professor Nadia Al-Ali is a specialist in the Middle East and Women's Studies from SOAS London University. Matthew Morris is from the International Committee of the Red Cross. And in Salford, Yasmin Nilawi from Rethink Rebuild, which is a Syrian advocacy group based in Manchester. Welcome all of you. Professor Al-Ali, the talks in Vienna are initially about trying to establish a ceasefire between President Assad's army and rebel fighters, a transitional government in place within 6 months, before securing a transition to an inclusive government that represents everybody through free and fair elections in 18 months. That is unbelievably ambitious, but is it doable?
I don't think so. And first of all, I should say lots of people were not sitting around that table. I mean, women were not sitting around the table. That is, really, really...
Sorry, did you say women?
Women,
yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Where were the Syrian women? So I think that's really...
Where are the Syrian men? I mean, there's no Syrians.
There were no Syrian men either. So there's a big problem in terms of who is involved in these peace talks. Another big issue is that right now we have the only on-the-ground troops who are actually fighting ISIS are Kurds. Kurds are not involved in these negotiations either. Kurds are not supported right now. I mean, if anything, Western governments, including this country, stands by as Turkey is actually attacking Kurds. So this whole thing doesn't make sense. And we know from the Iraqi context that military intervention without a close look at what is happening on the ground is just going to create much more chaos and violence. So, when...
So even though there's a military track, as David Cameron would like there to be, there's the political and diplomatic track. David Cameron also talks about the humanitarian track. What is missing, you say, is an immediate plan for rebuilding on the ground?
What is missing is actually stopping the double standard and hypocrisy, and actually support those people who are fighting ISIS, which is the Kurds. Secondly, to be inclusive in peace talks and include the Syrian opposition, include Syrian women. Syrian women are organized inside the country, outside. There cannot be proper, we know everywhere in the world that there cannot be sustainable peace if women are not involved.
Okay. Let me bring Yasmin in. Tell me what you think about the Vienna peace talks and whether or not you think they can work.
Well, I would echo many things of what was just said, and I think in looking at the past 4 or 5 years of the Syrian conflict, the only time that talks have really worked is in 2013 when we backed up the talks with a credible threat of military force. Assad has shown time and time again that he will not uphold negotiations, and we had numerous failed diplomatic efforts in that regard. So I think that we're also looking at the wrong picture here. We're asking the wrong questions. We're saying we want to vote to extend airstrikes against ISIS. Now, what are we doing to address the primary threat in Syria, which is the Assad regime, which has given rise to the radicalization in Syria?
Well, what the Prime Minister might say to that is, well, look, we're going to work through over months to come up with free and fair elections.
Well, again, negotiations in Syria have never succeeded if they weren't backed by a credible threat of military force. So we want guarantees for civilians.
There is a credible threat of military force. In fact, there may be, it may be extended if MPs vote here tonight.
Well, not against the primary driver of this crisis.
I understand. Against Assad. Okay, yeah, I understand.
And if we don't address the threat caused by the Assad regime, then we're not in a position to address the threat caused by ISIS. And looking at the past year, the Americans have already been involved in this campaign for over a year. What success have we seen in Syria? Absolutely nothing. ISIS has grown in Syria over the past year. So can we reevaluate our strategy here and try to think of something that will work?
Okay. Matthew Morris, let's talk to you about the humanitarian side of things, which Mr. Cameron also says is very important. We know that 250,000 Syrians have already died in this civil war over the last 4 or 5 years. How does Britain, potentially joining in the bombing in Syria, ameliorate the humanitarian crisis?
Well, at the ICRC, we work in a confidential way to talk to nation states or armed groups about the impact of the conduct of their hostilities. So that's something we would do behind the doors. But I was recently on the border between Syria and Jordan, and I was speaking to people who'd been fleeing a wide array of areas in Syria, and they were telling me what the situation was like right now. People who'd lost family members, they'd lost homes, they had very limited access to food, to water, to shelter. They were really in desperate need. And then if you multiply what they were saying to other villages, towns, regions, and then add into the fact that this is such a complicated, protracted and ever-changing conflict, then you do have a really complicated situation. Any civilian in any conflict zone will be worried about where the next bomb or bullet may come from. And as you say, some of the statistics are staggering. There are 8 million people who've been displaced within the country. Some of those have been displaced several times. They found a safe haven somewhere, perhaps with family or relatives, and then they've been forced to move on. And 4 million perhaps people have left and living in other countries, and we have the complicated situation of the migratory trail people moving to Europe. So the situation is very bleak.
Can I just come in here?
Of course.
I totally agree with Yasmin. I mean, most of the people who are fleeing and are experiencing this violence are experiencing it because of the Assad regime. That doesn't in any way make ISIS any less of a threat.
Yeah.
But ISIS doesn't just exist in Syria. It also exists in Iraq. It exists here, and we need to really think much more carefully, because what is going to happen after the bombing of Raqqa is that we were going to radicalize more people inside Syria because innocent civilians will be killed. ISIS leaders are going to move to other places like Mosul, while the Assad regime will be even more
But not if, sorry to interrupt, but not if, as David Cameron puts it, the head of the snake is cut off. They'll be dead. They won't be moving anywhere.
No, there's no head of the snake. This is like, you cut, it's an animal, you cut one head and 10 other heads are coming.
Medusa.
It's not, I think that's a very, very simplistic way of looking at it.
Can I ask you, Yasmin, what you think of the Prime Minister's main argument, which is this would be an act of self-defence. Actually, ISIS have already brought the fight effectively to Britain, and this is about us protecting our citizens.
I think what we have to realize is that ISIS and Assad have a very close relationship with each other, and what we say as Syrians is they're two sides of the same coin. So I would agree that we wouldn't effectively be cutting off the head of the snake, because what would happen in Syria is, let's say hypothetically that we could get rid of ISIS through this campaign. The conditions on the ground are as such, because the Assad regime continues to bomb the cities, continues to cause this chaos and destruction and violence. The conditions are as such that on the ground we would just have the emergence of another radicalized group, because that is what the situation is like on the ground. So what we need to do is look at the root cause of the radicalization. What is causing radicalization in Syria? And that's the indiscriminate air attacks by the Assad regime. And unless we address those, we're not in a position to address the threat posed by ISIS.
Matthew, from a humanitarian point of view, what is your main concern right now as British voters await to see what MPs will do?
Well, obviously, our concern is that international humanitarian law, the wars of law, if you like, are respected. There are 3 key pillars to that in any conflict, in any airstrikes or ground campaign, whatever that is. There has to be distinction between civilians, civilian objects, and military objects and combatants.
Easier said than done.
Easier said than done, and we've seen in recent years, in ongoing conflicts and past conflicts, that it is very much easier said than done, but nevertheless it has to be said, and it has to be that we make this call that humanitarian law is respected. There has to be, all precautions have to be taken whenever a military strike of any nature is conducted, that civilians, medical facilities, non-combatants are protected.
Thank you all very much. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. Appreciate your time.